Why this?
In my business, you prepare for the unexpected.
And what business is that?
I help people with problems.
Problem solver.
I'm more of a problem eliminator.
When Timothy Dalton's first outing as James Bond, The Living Daylights, came out in the summer of 1987, it was a financial success, but a modest one. Audiences were not flocking to James Bond films in the way they used to. The formula needed to be shaken up because Bond was getting beaten at the box office by a new wave of action films. Kids were now going to see stuff like Die Hard, Lethal Weapon, Predator, Rambo. They were racking in the kind of dough that the James Bond movies when Sean Connery was playing Bond used to rack in back in the 60s. Obviously, the Bond producers wanted to cash in on this new hardcore action trend, and the decision was made to make the next James Bond installment the grittiest and most violent entry in the series' history. In fact, to this day, I'd still say License to Kill is by far the most violent James Bond film. Now, in this one, Timothy Dalton's James Bond is out for revenge when his best buddy from the CIA, Felix Leiter, played by David Hedison, the only man to ever play Felix Leiter twice, he first played him in Live and Let Die, is attacked by an evil drug lord named Sanchez, played by the great Robert Davi. Felix Leiter is left badly mauled, by sharks no less, missing a leg, while his wife Della is murdered. Bond, with it reminding him of his own wife being killed, of course, goes on the warpath, vowing to kill the Colombian drug lord that's responsible for the attack. Now, License to Kill is by far the most controversial James Bond movie ever made. In fact, a lot of people really didn't like this one when it came out. It was panned because people said it wasn't really a James Bond movie. People said it was a lot like a Joel Silver movie or a Miami Vice episode. And sure, it was definitely more timely in that way. I remember being blown away by it somewhat when I was a kid because it seemed so much harder edged and violent, much more contemporary than the other James Bond movies, which always feel kind of somewhat timeless. I think License to Kill in some ways is probably the result of the Broccoli family and Michael G. Wilson having watched a whole bunch of Joel Silver action movies. Every frame of this film screams late 80s action flick, from the Michael Kamen score to the violent action sequences to the Colombian drug dealer villain that was ripped from the headlines. Heck, it even has an 80s style bar fight that looks like it came out of Roadhouse.
Oh shit! Fight!
James Bond in a bar. I mean, that's just strange to me.
Touché.
Now, despite the fact that this is very controversial for James Bond fans, and it was a movie that a lot of them didn't like back in the 80s, it has really ratcheted up quite a cult following in the years since, and I have to say, I really like License to Kill. Just like his other entry, Living Daylights, it's an underrated flick. In fact, I'd wager that Timothy Dalton is probably the most consistent James Bond actor ever because both of his movies are really good. Now, the film isn't especially faithful to the established formula of the franchise. Michael G. Wilson co-wrote the script with Richard Maibaum, and actually would be Richard Maibaum's last time working on a Bond movie. And it really does kind of feel like an 80s action flick. James Bond even quits the Secret Service in a scene that blew my mind as a kid.
Then you have my resignation, sir.
We're not a country club, 007.
That said, it's probably more faithful to the character than people think. In the Ian Fleming novels, James Bond was a lot more rough-edged than he ever was in the films, and a lot of the most violent incidents in the film are right out of Fleming. Felix Leiter being fed to sharks was actually taken out of Live and Let Die, the novel. It was too violent, so they didn't use it in the 1970s. I feel that Timothy Dalton was really a devotee of the Ian Fleming books and played him as kind of this tired, worn-out British secret agent. Daniel Craig has kind of come close to what Dalton was doing in terms of darkness, but I really do think that Dalton played him in a way that was utterly unique.
A farewell to arms.
The film is really kind of split up into two halves. The first half of the movie is probably where it's the most quintessentially 80s, with James Bond out for revenge, putting together leads, doing a little bit of detective work, which is rare for a Bond movie, and, getting into kind of 80s staples of action films, getting into bar fights and all that, and meeting up with the tough but sassy love interest, Carrie Lowell's Pam Bouvier, who I absolutely adore. It's strange seeing kind of Timothy Dalton walking around in America because most of the film is set in Miami. Miami. And I also found that the cut of his suits is really weird in this movie. I think that Timothy Dalton never really felt comfortable in formal wear, so they were trying to make him a little bit more cash. And some of the cuts on his jackets and the blazers that he uses and the kind of the loose structuring of some of the suits kind of rubbed me the wrong way when I watched it again recently, because it doesn't feel especially James Bond-like. I think he probably could have taken a couple of fashion tips from Don Johnson as Sonny Crockett if we're talking about killing some bad guys in Miami.
Surf's up, pal.
The first half of the film, though, is probably where it's at its best as Bond starts to investigate one of Sanchez's associates, Milton Crest, played by Anthony Zerbe. At this point, another of Bond's friends, Sharky, who's kind of a Quarrel-esque character and played by another 80s action mainstay, Frank McRae, is killed by some of Crest's henchmen. Once Bond sees Sharky's lifeless body, he flies into a blind rage, and in one of the most badass sequences in the franchise's history, calmly takes a harpoon gun, walks up to the man responsible, and shoots the guy point blank in the chest, telling him,
Compliments of Sharky.
pretty badass for a James Bond movie. And in fact, there's a rough cut of the movie that's out there on the internet where Bond actually starts laughing maniacally after he kills the guy, which I think probably would have taken things a little too far. It's pretty awesome stuff, but the film slows down a little bit once they hit Mexico City and Bond starts infiltrating Sanchez's cartel, with Michael G. Wilson on the Blu-ray saying he was always inspired by A Fistful of Dollars and Yojimbo, in the fact that Bond is playing one side against the other. It's a little bit more Bond-esque, I think, in this way, because it's more of a glamorous location. Bond's wearing tuxedos more, and even Q shows up. But luckily, Q actually gets a much larger role than usual, with him also going AWOL from the Secret Service in order to help Bond out on his mission.
Really, 007?
Q, what the hell are you doing here? I might have killed you.
Well, I'm on leave. Thought I'd pop around and see how you're getting on.
Awesome stuff, and I have to say, I always did find that Q loved Bond, and I think the relationship between him and Timothy Dalton's Bond was probably the warmest of everyone, except for maybe Roger Moore and Desmond Llewellyn, who are actually good friends in real life. Now, Timothy Dalton as Bond does a really good job, and it's such a pity that he never got a third film, as I really think he would have won more people over had he been given a little bit more time. Both of his films are so good, although everyone seems to enjoy beating up on the guy due to the fact that his films didn't exactly break box office records and his tenure as the character was very short. I'd love to see Dalton make kind of a serious comeback. He came pretty close with Penny Dreadful and certainly hasn't been wanting for work. He was in Hot Fuzz as a great villain. He was Mr. Pricklepants in the Toy Story series, and he's on Doom Patrol. He's in his 60s now, and I could really kind of see him growing into this kind of supporting character in a Brian Cox type mold. In fact, I think he even kind of looks like Brian Cox now. Really love Timothy Dalton. I think his performance as Bond in this film is spectacular. I'd give it about a 9 on 10. The only reason I don't give it a 10 on 10 is that it's not super Bond-like, I think, when we think of the traditional film version of the character. Still, I really like him in this movie, and I wish he'd gotten a third film. They came pretty close with this movie called Property of a Lady, but maybe it was best that it didn't get made, because apparently at one point Bond was supposed to fight a robotic henchwoman. I mean, Bond meets the Terminator. It might have been a little too much. The villain in this movie, really good. Robert Davi kind of rubs me a little bit the wrong way these days with some of his political statements, but man, he was a good villain. He plays Sanchez. Sanchez is a drug lord in the Pablo Escobar mode, and I really like that Davi doesn't kind of play him as a raving lunatic like some of the other Bond villains. It's actually believable that the charismatic, somewhat personable Sanchez could inspire loyalty from his men and build an empire. The only time he really ever loses it is when he tries to get his girlfriend back, Talisa Soto's Lupe, who keeps leaving him over and over again because he's a monster. There's a really brutal scene where he whips her, which is extremely violent for a movie that ended up going out as a PG-13, and I'm surprised. He has a mean, sadistic streak, which you see over and over again in the film, but for the most part, Sanchez is cool and laid back, and I think he kind of wants to be James Bond's friend in certain ways. Him and Dalton have really good chemistry. I also really enjoy seeing a young Benicio del Toro as Sanchez's right-hand man, Dario, and man, is his death scene ever brutal. There are, of course, a couple of minor villains in this film, with Don Stroud playing Heller and Everett McGill as Felix Leiter's CIA friend who betrays him and gets a brutal killing from James Bond. Killifer tries to bribe Bond, doesn't work out very well. And then you also get Anthony Zerbe as Milton Crest, who again has also another brutal death scene. I'm actually shocked at how violent this movie was, although the version that I was watching recently is the version that's out in Blu-ray and digital, which apparently is actually the R-rated version of the movie. You see, when it was submitted to the MPAA, it was slapped with an R rating and they cut it down to a PG-13, and that's the version that came out in theaters. But when they were remastering it in 4K, they decided to go with the more violent version, which is something that's never really been talked about too much. Anyway, the villains in this movie, to me, are some of the best ever in the Bond series, so I give them a 10 on 10. Again, also, the Bond girls in this movie are so good. Talisa Soto is beautiful as Lupe, who's kind of Sanchez's squeeze and starts to fall for Bond, but the one who really steals the show is Carrie Lowell as one of the toughest Bond girls of all time, an ex-CIA pilot named Pam Bouvier. She's smoking hot, and in many ways, her tough-as-nails action heroine was ahead of her time. Bouvier is the type of character I could see somebody like Angelina Jolie or Charlize Theron playing. Carrie Laurel is so beautiful in this film, but man, does she ever look good with short hair. She looks good with long hair, but as soon as there's that scene, that reveal when she shows up with a smoking hot short haircut and Bond does a double take, whew, good stuff. I give the Bond girls in this one another 10 on 10. The Bond music is a bit more of a mixed bag. You see, John Barry quit the franchise just after Living Daylights, so they got Michael Kamen, who had scored Die Hard and the Lethal Weapon series, in to provide the music. He was, again, the quintessential 80s action movie composer, and his score is good. It's really good. It's just not super Bond-like. He does use the James Bond theme quite a bit, but you almost expect Eric Clapton to come in and start playing the James Bond theme. And in fact, Eric Clapton apparently did do a cover of the James Bond theme that's never seen the light of day. It's a good action movie score and it suits the movie like a glove. It's not super James Bond-like, but I still like it. The theme song by Gladys Knight, not bad. License to Kill. I mean, it must have been hard to write a song called License to Kill. Noteworthy, the closing song, If I Asked You To, which is written by Diane Warren and sung by Patti LaBelle, became a massive hit some years later when Celine Dion covered it. I'll give it an 8 on 10. A 008 on 10. In terms of Bond one-liners, there aren't really that many in this film because Bond is very serious. The only time he kind of cracks wise at all is when, he gets revenge for Sharky or when he kills Killifer. But even then, it's more of a cold-blooded one-liner than an actual haha funny one-liner. It's also pretty short on double entendres. I think the movie was a little bit more politically correct than some other James Bond installments. Things had changed a bit by the late 80s, and the film is definitely a reflection of its time. There are some good gadgets, however, because, like I said earlier, Desmond Llewellyn has a major supporting role in this film as Q, and actually gets to work a bit in the field. He gives him an awesome signature gun that can only be fired by him, and was the first time I'd ever heard of the concept. There's also a camera that shoots lasers and for some reason takes X-ray photos. I didn't really care for that one too much. Oh yeah, and then Q has a rake that's also a walkie-talkie. And I guess in the 80s that was cool. Now, it has to be said, this film was not a box office hit, at least not North America. It was hampered by the fact that it had some of the most boring trailers you can imagine. I mean, they really did not sell this movie well.
Problem solved.
I'm more of a problem eliminator.
I feel like everybody involved was just kind of coasting and expecting it to do well just because it was a James Bond movie. And boy, what a mistake did they make, because it came out in the summer of 1989, which has gone down in history as sequel summer. This was the summer that Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade started things off with a bang, and then Lethal Weapon 2 came out and was a huge hit, and you had a little movie called Batman that totally took the air out of the box office, and there was Honey, I Shrunk the Kids, there was Roadhouse, there was all kinds of huge movies, and James Bond just couldn't keep up. It was even outgrossed by Star Trek V, The Final Frontier, which everybody always says is the worst film in the series.
Piss off.
License to Kill made an anemic $33 million domestically, which was a disaster for a James Bond movie considering how much it cost, although worldwide it was a pretty big hit. It made $156 million, which was actually above what The Living Daylights made, but North America is such a huge market for James Bond movies, it couldn't help but be seen as some kind of major disappointment, and I think that's probably why we never got a third Timothy Dalton film, although, again, like I said, they came pretty close. I've always thought this was one of the best James Bond movies, even though it's very divisive, so give it a strong 8 on 10. Of course, this was the end of the Timothy Dalton era, a premature end if I do say so myself, but we were about to embark on an all-new era. Unfortunately, it would take a long time to get there, 6 years, before we'd finally get Pierce Brosnan as James Bond, the role that he came so close to playing in 1987 when they went into production on The Living Daylights. But of course, that's a story for another time.
Thank you for clicking on our video, everybody. If you like what you saw here, please make sure you like the video and subscribe and share with your friends who like this sort of content. Joe Blow was created by movie fans for movie fans, and we appreciate your support.